Okay, so as you know, we are right smack dab in the middle of a discussion about the economic determinants of democratization. And this has us talking about the economic factors that lead to democratic transitions and that sustain and support democracy more generally. And this discussion has really mainly been about economic development and growth, right? And we talked about the stages in the process of development according to modernization theory, the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society that is characterized by manufacturing and services. And we talked about how the transition from dictatorship to democracy is really one implication of modernization theory. And remember that modernization theory is just one mechanism for what connects development and democratization. And we talked about not just classic modernization theory that focuses on those stages, but we also talked about Lipset's argument and Lipset's focus on education and the role of the middle class and the rise of the middle class and how these factors become so important to democracy. Well, there are two other stories or two other accounts that fall under the modernization sort of rubric. And those are the wealth story and the survival story. And we're going to deal with each of these in turn and discuss what they mean and then draw out their testable implications. And then we'll actually look at some data as well. And we'll get to the bottom of this and we'll really test and kind of evaluate the implications and find out to what degree these different stories help to account for the apparent link between development and democracy. And remember, this is all taking place under this sort of heading of modernization as being one link between development and democracy. Now, we're going to begin this in a way that I hope can help us to begin thinking about the choices and the issues involved. And this is often a fun question to ask any audience when you're discussing democracy and development and economic growth and so on and so forth. And the question goes like this: assume you are a rich person. Would you rather be rich in a dictatorship like China, for example, or rich in a democracy like the United States? And let's put aside, some of the legitimate debate about the credentials of either of these regimes and just assume that they're ideal types and use them as examples. And so I want to put it to you, and I want to hear from you through the mic as well as maybe the chat. Would you rather be rich in a dictatorship or rich in a democracy, assuming that you are rich?
Well, if I was rich, I would much rather be rich in a dictatorship because it is easier to bribe a state enterprise to get out of paying additional taxes, whereas in a democracy, it's harder to get away with. And you gain more power and influence as a rich person in a dictatorship because you're closer to the state center by virtue of being one of the wealthiest in the country, whereas a democracy, in theory, you're one of many.
Okay, let's hear from some others.
For me, if I'd say like I was like a rich person and I like rich in a dictatorship versus rich in a democracy, I would say, in terms, I know we were talking a little bit about this last week, on how dictatorship can be more closely tied to, is more closely associated with communist leadership, whereas democracies can be more closely tied towards capitalist leadership. So I would choose to be rich in the United States, which is more of a capitalist leadership, because it allows you to maintain a lot more of your wealth. You can literally see, like right now, how the majority of the richest people in the world are living in the United States. There have been a lot of exceptions and a lot of like routes to either attain those insane amounts of money and keep those insane amounts of money. And like even if it's like a oh, say you're donating this much, there are a lot of loopholes that like will allow you to donate like insane amounts, but you're still technically not losing anything because of like tax loopholes and stuff that are specifically helping for the rich. So I think that if I were like, say, like I were like a billionaire, I'd rather be a billionaire in the United States than any other country, or country like the United States, because it's pretty much the government in the capitalist system basically like is giving you like kind of a free pass, and like even if it seems like you're giving your wealth, you're not really giving that much, and whatever you do give will eventually like kind of come back to you.
Okay, so let's hear from some others.
If I may, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Okay. So I completely agree with Daniela because, like, let's think about it, right? It's funny how I feel like in authoritarian regimes, it's super easy to like, it's not super easy, but there's already a disdain for the government, you already think that, oh, I hate them. How dare they, And then in like the US, we don't hate them because we have freedoms. We have the opportunity to get a job. We can choose to get the job, somewhat, even though it's not completely to the extent that it should be, But we have that. We have a higher level of freedom than other people in other regimes do, and like oppressive regimes do. So when we've never had like a revolt that overthrows the upper class, and in the US at least, and that's not something that was I don't see happening until very, very recently, that we finally say eat the rich,
Mm-hmm.
In other like authoritarian regimes, like when they were being oppressed that way, then of course they had a disdain for them, because they're like, clearly I don't even have food to eat, and here you are wasting all this money, and here we at least have food to eat. So then we try to work within the capitalist system, while in these authoritarian regimes they try to dismantle it completely. So I feel like if I were to be rich, of course I'd want to be inside the US, because people always justify the American dream of getting rich someday. So I don't know.
Absolutely. So we'll go to Jose in a minute. I want to summarize the points so far. So Ishan says, better to be rich in a dictatorship because you can bribe the government or state enterprises, and maybe obtain other benefits kind of unlawfully, so to speak. And then Samantha and Daniela say that a democracy might be more supportive for a rich person because of freedoms and because of the consistency maybe between democracy and capitalism. Jose, can we hear from you?
Okay, so I was gonna, the easy way out is to say a democracy is better, because you don't have to directly contribute to the government, and your wealth doesn't get attacked as often as does in a dictatorship like China. But I agree with everyone to this point, but I want to do like a devil's advocate. So I'm gonna say that in a dictatorship, a wealthier person profits most, because not only will the government invest in their company, but if the government is successful, they're successful, and therefore, if since the government is enforcing and supporting them, they get the support of the people. So, in a sense, the wealthy are viewed as benefactors for society in a dictatorship. Yeah, that'd be it.
But that's your devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to reiterate a point that Jose made, which is that in a dictatorship, Jose says, your wealth may be attacked more often and more aggressively by the government. That's a very interesting point, and I'd like to hear from more people through the mic and through the chat here on this question. It's an interesting question, and all the views so far are very interesting. Who else wants to share their input?
Me personally. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Avo and then Edwin. How about that?
So I think you're better off being rich in a democracy, because if you look at countries that have dictatorships, you see North Korea and their leader, and you compare it with someone rich in the U.S. like Jeff Bezos. It's like they have different types of wealth, and I feel like Jeff Bezos has more of an opportunity to like use his wealth in order to benefit himself, whereas North Korea, I think he's in a way he's limited, the leader of North Korea.
That's a really interesting take, Edwin. That's an argument I hadn't thought about. In a democracy, you might have more ways of growing your wealth or using your wealth in ways that you see fit than you would in a dictatorship. Very interesting. Gustavo, can you share your input?
I was gonna say that I would rather be rich in a democracy because at least me personally, I'm very open about like my political ideologies and what I believe in. So in a dictatorship, if I were rich and I was against like the dictatorship's like political point of view, I'll probably be persecuted in my family and stuff like that. And I personally wouldn't want to go through that. But in like the United States, like you could invest in what you want, you could buy whatever you want, and you don't even have to be in politics to be wealthy in the United States. And we see that through like corporations, and we even see that through things such as like music, like artists, like they're wealthy and they're not very like politically active.
Ah, okay. That's another interesting point. And what's really interesting is that kind of goes with the logic of Ishan's point, who said that in a place like China, you can bribe the government or state enterprises to grow your wealth. But as Gustavo points out, but in a democracy, you don't need to do that necessarily, right? You might be freer to pursue wealth creation through other means, right? And you might not need to get involved in that dirty dealing. And that may be a reason to prefer a democracy if you're a rich person, like Jeff Bezos, for example. That's a really interesting take. And that's another point that I hadn't thought of. Great. Other perspectives or other points of support or other input.
So I know that I just said that I would rather be in a democracy, but Jose changed my mind completely.
Okay.
So the thing is, when we research like who are the richest people in the world, you don't see anyone from this time frame. You just don't, because the thing is that we've now, even though like Jeff Bezos is way richer than any one of us, you know, the disparities in money we've gotten to this point where we're getting to a point where we want to have that equality, and we're forgetting that like the pharaohs in ancient Egypt were way richer than any one of their slaves. We're forgetting that, like, because we're thinking about it. Oh my God, sorry. I thought there was a cat outside. We're forgetting about it. We're thinking about it in this historical context. But the thing is, because now we have, you know, rights, and there's like the UN that determines where and how money goes or whatever, and you know, we take record. We're not even thinking about like in ancient Egypt or like ancient Rome, where Nero used to spend money, and he had so much money that he ordered his soldiers to go fight against the water because he didn't like the hurricanes or something like that. And like when you have money like that, you can tell people to do stuff like that. And no one, even Jeff Bezos, has that type of money right now. No one, like the richest person in the history of the world is 100 times richer than Jeff Bezos, and he's the richest person alive right now. And they were all successful under authoritarian regimes.
Interesting.
So I don't know.
So the possibilities for wealth creation and like expanding your wealth might be greater in like a dictatorship for reasons that relate to the characteristics of the regime. Interesting. Let me take a look at the chat. Arturo says democracy. In a dictatorship, the dictator can easily take your money. In a democracy, you can easily lobby politicians and keep your wealth. Interesting point, Arturo. You're getting very close to the wealth story that we'll talk about here in a moment. Juan says, in a democracy, it allows you to not have sovereign and have the free will to do anything with your money, as opposed to a dictatorship, because you have to be loyal and show the support for your country. You have the free will to do as you may. So again, this emphasis on freedoms that you might have in a democracy that you may not have in a dictatorship. And Juan makes a compelling point in support of that perspective. Daniela says the American dream does kind of promote wealth obtaining. It certainly does. And that's interesting because that's consistent with your point, Daniela, about how democracy might be consistent with capitalism in a way that could be very beneficial or more beneficial for a rich person than, say, a dictatorship, to the extent that the dictatorship might be more closed economically, if those things go hand in hand. John says, I think I would still rather live in the US because in a dictatorship, you would have to be more closely linked with the regime. In the US, you can be rich and not care about politics at all. Good, John. So you're pointing out that, to what degree does keeping your wealth require you to, subjugate yourself or sort of subordinate yourself to the regime in a dictatorship, right? Do you have to kind of cozy up to them and play footsie in order to keep your money, so to speak? Daniela adds, you can still influence politics greatly with wealth in a democracy, super PACs, political donors, the general economy. Jocelyn adds lobbying as well. These are absolutely channels for influencing policy that can affect your bottom line, without a doubt. Hi, Arturo. I'm just seeing your message. I'm really sorry. You made a fantastic point, and I read that. If you want to add something, you can speak right now. But your point that you made through the chat was really good. And but I'll give you the floor. Do you want to say something, Arturo?
Yeah, because I was thinking about it right after hearing all these propositions. But one thing I want to take into account was that I was born and raised in the U.S., right? So I have the U.S. mentality, the Western mentality. But what about the Asian mentality, right? Like I was not born in China. What does rich look in China? What does the regime look there? Having lived through it, well, I've been indoctrinated to the U.S. regime, if that makes sense. So I'm studying politics, right? Like even history, because someone brought ancient Egypt, and that's a good point. But if we bring up the bourgeoisie, when they came into power, when they toppled I think one of the kings in France, because they were spending all the gold just making the gold stuff, they toppled him, and then the bourgeoisie was created. So going back at it, I feel in a dictatorship, you can maintain as a rich person, because in a democracy, politicians will always want to save themselves. In a dictatorship, politicians will not want to save themselves because they will want to save you, if that makes sense, because you're the one that's funding them, or you're the one that's creating the capital for them. For example, like let's say you're a company in China, right? China's gonna fight to get the better trade tariffs for you, while you're a company in the U.S. or a person in the U.S. Who can bring the best money? That's basically gonna be it. Like who is it gonna be, the people action, or is it gonna be company action? Or in China, it's gonna be more of a loyalty.
So I think the question for you, Arturo, that you'd have to manage is, do dictatorships rely on, the sort of benefits of having rich capitalists? Do they rely on those capitalists more than democracies do? Or are these regimes, or these types of regimes, democratic and authoritarian governments, kind of equally dependent on those rich people? And that might be the question, but your perspective is very interesting, and I'm glad that you took the mic. Ishan, you can defend dictatorship again if you'd like. You want to make a comment?
All right, so yeah, that's sort of what I wanted to touch on, is the size of the selector and how the leader gets chosen in a dictatorship. So naturally, because of being in a dictatorship, the amount of people the dictator needs to keep happy are significantly smaller than any individual democracy. So while we discuss the role of lobbying, it is significantly easier to lobby when you have a total of 100 people in a group that have an audience with a dictator than 100,000 in a democracy. So I understand the idea that, well, you can just lobby for your beliefs and that will work in the grand scale of politics because you're Jeff Bezos and are loaded. But it's important to note how much easier lobbying is when you have an available audience with the leader.
Yeah. And what Ishan's referring to, everyone, is the fact that in a dictatorship, what's called the winning coalition, or the small group whose support must be maintained, is very small. And that means then that, well, if you're a rich person or a very rich person, you might easily be within that coalition, and you might be very important to the survival of that dictatorship and that dictator. And so they might in turn really cater to you and your interests. And on the other hand, however, and this is a point that Ishan would have to think about, I think, is the fact that because that winning coalition is so small, there are many replaceables. There are many, many potentially rich people outside of that coalition who can replace that rich person. And what we'd want to think about is, well, how easily can that person be replaced in that winning coalition as a result of the nature of the regime? And does that change the fate of a rich person in a dictatorship versus a democracy? And this is just my response to the very interesting and relevant point about coalition size and how, you know, interests lobby and influence decision-making in these types of regimes. Yuel says, assuming I'm rich and not in favor for the common worker, I'd thrive under the US. And as for China, who's to say their structures aren't ruling a slow growing armed struggle? Whereas in the US, there is this opportunity for a bargaining of elites. Agency will appear less severe to the rich. Under a said democracy, there will be shades of autocracy in my favor if I were rich. Interesting. A bargaining of elites in the US. I'm wondering how much bargaining can take place among those few whose support is essential to the survival of the dictatorship in a place like China, to respond to Yoel's point. But absolutely interesting, and I'm glad to hear this, Yoel. Thank you for sharing. Gustavo, if you want to disagree with that, I'll go ahead and read your comment here. Jose agrees with I think Samantha, making the point about ancient regimes were known for wasting wealth in a deplorable manner. Interesting. Gustavo says, yeah, and although that may be true, Jose, the wealthy still have that sort of power. It may not be sending people to war, but a lot of the wealthy people still have a grip on people's lives because they are the ones who produce jobs and even the products people use, so they benefit both ways in democratic government. A good nuanced in a good pushback from Gustavo, the fact that in a similar way, capitalists are also essential in a democracy. In fact, you might argue that you can make the argument maybe that they become more important in a democracy for reasons that relate to the need for governments to maintain investment and to be viewed as sort of hospitable and open in promoting democracy and individual rights and so on and so forth, because it may often be tied to, you know, belonging to other international organizations or some kind of access to credit or whatever it is, right? There are a lot of considerations. Jocelyn says, winning coalition. I think that Jocelyn's point, I'm not sure, Jocelyn, are you saying that the winning coalition being so small in a dictatorship might mean that you'd be better off being rich in a dictatorship, or do you see it working the other way?
I think I agree with the first statement that you made. I think it's easier as a winning coalition if you're rich there to be more wealthy and to stay wealthy, because a dictator only really cares about like that small amount of group. So it doesn't matter anybody else because they'll like keep oppressing them basically.
So maybe it's better to be in a democracy if you're rich. Is that the takeaway, Jocelyn?
Well, I guess, I mean, they both have like their pros and cons, because if you think about it like a democracy, you can stay rich as long as you're like lobbying and stuff, but like in a dictatorship, as long as you're in the winning coalition, you're always going to be like rich. But if you're outside of the winning coalition, then you're, you know, against all odds basically.
Right. It's risky. Good. Yeah, very good. Jose says, definitely, nowadays in a more democratic world, the wealth is placed in more ambiguous areas that are less visible with the naked eye. I mean, some wealthy people just spend as much as they desire on cars and houses, but others buy companies and absorb businesses to grow their wealth. But yeah, since they own so many jobs, they basically control the public opinion that surrounds them. Maximo says, in this discussion of ancient regimes, you guys are comparing the leaders of ancient civilizations where any wealth of the state was theirs to just being a general rich person in the US. The comparison is flawed. Good point, Maximo. I think that that's valid. One response they might have for you is, but yeah, the potential to become that rich and accumulate that power and use that power still exists in that ancient regime. But your response could easily be, but yeah, there are so few of them, and they're the leaders after all, and that's what makes them the leaders. And so, interesting debate. Arturo says, I will say though that if we think about it, being rich in any regime would feel pretty good right now. Touche, Arturo. And this is you know, something that is probably indisputable. But this brings us to the wealth story. This discussion that we're having about wealth and regime type and whether it's better to be rich in a democracy or dictatorship really relates closely to the wealth story, which argues that the nature of the link between development and democracy has to do with the increase in wealth and the rise in income levels in countries that become economically developed, and the way that those changes in income then in turn change and impact on the regime type and then help to support democracy. And so the wealth story predicts that countries are more likely to become and remain democratic as they become wealthier. And so this kind of seems to support or go along with those perspectives that said that it might be better to be in a democracy when you're rich. The question, of course, is why does wealth help democracy, or what is the link between wealth and democracy, and why might it be that wealth would support democracy? And what we know, and the way the wealth story works, is that there's really a choice between democracy and dictatorship that can be thought of as a choice between a system where you are guaranteed a minimal standard of consumption and a system in which you win or lose everything. And this relates so closely to all the points made. The stakes are really high in a dictatorship. You can gain everything or you can easily lose everything because you don't, by definition, have the same rights and the same protections against that kind of predation by the state. In a democracy, by contrast, at least in terms of the ideal understanding of democracy, you would be protected against that kind of extortion. And your wealth and your income would be saved from that kind of state predation. And the point is that when you are rich, getting a bigger share of the pie affects your welfare only a little, but losing everything would be truly disastrous, right? Like when you become a rich person, your income only grows so much, even if you are making millions a day in some cases. But if you lost all of that, that would be the end of you, and that would be a truly disastrous outcome. And so this is why, according to this theory, the wealth story, dictatorship is a really big gamble if you're a rich person, because you risk losing everything because of the lack of protections against predation and extortion by the state. And if you think that this is just theoretical, consider the case of Argentina. In 1975, the second of two military regimes in the space of 15 years took power after a coup. And in the course of the next 5 years, they absolutely robbed the conservative, landed, aristocratic elites in Argentina. They took everything from them and they resold all their belongings. They took all their assets. Truly, look into it. And this was particularly stunning because these conservative elites used to be the allies of the military in earlier generations. As early as recently as 30 years earlier, they were ardent supporters of the military. Now, this story, this wealth story about the risks involved in dictatorship if you're a rich person, it makes the suggestion that wealth should then lead to democracy because rich people or income levels increasing should help to support that movement to democracy and a system that would protect against those arbitrary extortions or the taking or the predation by the state in the way that they might take the assets of those rich people. Now, on the other hand, if you're a poor person, autocracy is not much of a gamble in comparison because you don't have much to lose. You have everything to gain, and you might actually gain a lot through, bribing state enterprises, but you have a lot to gain and very little to lose in a very general sense. And this is the nature of the wealth story. Now, the wealth story is one of two stories that fall under what we're calling other variants of modernization theory. Now, this first one is supposed to say the wealth story. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. The second one is survival story. And this is a little bit different. It predicts that democracy is more likely to survive as countries become wealthier, but not more likely to emerge. Now, that contrasts with the wealth story, which says that democracy is more likely to emerge and to survive if countries are wealthier. And the survival story really takes as its starting point the per capita income in Argentina in 1975. Surprise, Argentina. That per capita income was $6,055. And Argentina is an example of democratic failure in 1975. And that's why it creates this kind of boundary line. And what we can say is that no democracy has collapsed as long as it has had a per capita income higher than that of Argentina in 1975. Now, to know how that would, translate to today's dollars, we'd have to, of course, do the math and look at the adjustment. And I can't tell you what that is. But the point is, there's a boundary and a threshold, and there's a pretty clear pattern where countries that reach a certain level of income do not tend to collapse in terms of the regime type. Now, we can depict these two stories, if you will, in the following way. On the one hand, we have the wealth story, which we're calling the wealth story because it's a variant of modernization theory. In the wealth story, predicts that as countries get wealthier or richer, transitions to dictatorship decline in probability, and transitions to democracy increase in probability. This is the nature of the wealth story, right? This is how we can depict this in this form. Now, the survival story is slightly different. Transitions to dictatorship also decline in probability as wealth increases, but all regime transitions decline in probability as wealth increases. And transitions to democracy are unaffected because remember that the survival story makes predictions about not transitions, but the survival of regimes once they are in place. This is how we can represent these and think of these in terms of the way they look and the logic of the argument. Now, last week we saw some data, and that data is consistent with both stories, both the wealth story and the survival story. And the data suggests that wealth leads to the emergence and the survival of democracies, and that wealth does not lead to the emergence of democracies, but does increase democratic survival. Now, how can it be consistent with both? It's consistent with both because we're not actually able to tell from this data which story is more correct per se, or which one is more correct at least than the other. And so we saw this last week. This is the proportion of countries that are democratic at different income levels. And we have different income levels in 1985 dollars, purchasing power US dollars, GDP per capita, it's a measure of individual wealth income. And what we see is that at the highest income levels, the proportion of democratic countries is almost perfectly one. And what that means then is there's a clear relationship between rising income and the proportion of countries that are democratic. But again, this doesn't actually let us distinguish between the wealth story and the survival story. And it raises the question of whether these stories are correct, but it doesn't answer that question. And in order for us to answer that question, we have to examine other implications of the theories. And those other implications will relate to other things that we can test, and that must also be true. If it's true, that wealth and survival are features of the nature of the link between development and democracy. And so what we're going to do from here is we're going to examine some of these other implications. And we're going to do so by using data from Prworski in 2000. Now, we may be wanting newer data, but the truth is that the scope of the data is quite good, and it's representative enough just in the sense that it includes all possible cases up to that point. And it's data that is representative, at least in terms of the experience of democracies at that time. And so the implications from the wealth story and the survival story break down in the following way. So both the wealth story and the survival story imply that democracy is going to be more common in rich countries than poor countries. And they also imply that transitions to dictatorship become less likely as wealth increases. The wealth story on its own suggests that transitions to democracy become more likely as wealth increases. It's ambivalent about regime transitions. It doesn't say anything about regime transitions becoming more or less likely as countries become wealthier. Now, when we say regime transitions, what we mean is transitions to or from democracy. It does make predictions about transitions to democracy, but not necessarily about transitions from democracy. The survival story makes slightly different hypotheses, implications. In the first place, transitions to democracy are unaffected by increases in wealth, because remember that it says that democracy does not come about because of wealth, but wealth helps countries to remain democratic once they are democratic. And then it also implies that regime transitions become less likely as countries become wealthier. And so it's not ambivalent about the types of, in the frequency of transitions in the way that the wealth story is. It expects regime transitions to become less common as countries become wealthier. In other words, countries will become more stable and more continual in their regime type as they become wealthier. So these are predictions about these 4 observable implications. Now we're going to evaluate them using that data from Poworski. We're going to take a look at the different situations. And so in the first place, we'll test the first testable implication, and that is, remember, that democracy is more common in rich countries than poor countries. And as predicted by both stories, this data suggests that dictatorship is more common in poor countries and democracy is more common in rich countries. So take a look. As wealth increases from left to right, the total years under democracy increases substantially. Country years, that is the total country years democratic for all countries in the data set. That includes all democracies up until 2000. The years under dictatorship decline precipitously, and they really are the inverse of one another. You see a pretty clear sort of inverse relationship. As wealth increases, years under democracy increase, years under dictatorship decrease. And so this does support both stories, contention that dictatorship is more common in poor countries, democracy is more common in rich countries. And again, the wealth story says that this is because the rich have a lot to lose in a dictatorship. They have a lot to lose because there are not limits on the state's extortion or its predation in the way that there are limits in a democracy where the assets of the rich are going to be more easily protected and more intact over the long term. But this doesn't help us distinguish between the wealth story and the survival story. It does support both, but it doesn't help us arbitrate between them. And we need to look at something else to be able to arbitrate between them. And those 2 things are as follows. In the first place, the frequency of transitions in general, because remember that these stories, or at least the survival story, makes predictions about the frequency of transitions and how stable countries become at certain levels of wealth and whether they change from one regime to another or if they stay the same once they reach a certain level of wealth. But more in particular and more importantly, we need to look at the effect of increases in wealth on transitions to democracy. And this is going to help us to distinguish between the wealth story and the survival story. And so let's go ahead and do that. So what we see here is that at first glance, poor countries do appear to be less stable as the survival story predicts. What you find is that on the left side, where the poorer countries are concentrated, you find that transitions to dictatorship, as well as the total transitions, are quite numerous and higher. And even transitions to democracy are higher, which is an interesting fact because it suggests that the number of regime transitions is quite high and even the highest at the lower income levels. That does suggest that poor countries appear to be less stable and that change is more likely, as the survival story really predicts. But the problem with that is that comparing the raw number of transitions can be misleading because those transitions might take place, the number of transitions that might take place is constrained by the number of countries in each type. And we already know that these are not constant across those income levels. The world has more experience with poor countries than rich ones. And so what we might actually be seeing is in fact simply a larger number of poor countries than rich ones. In fact, the first world is distinctive because it's a category that includes far fewer countries than, say, the so-called third world. Now, these are labels that we don't subscribe to and I don't use, but for the purpose of illustrating the distinctions between poorer and richer countries, it's useful because there are many, many more poor countries in so-called third world countries than there are first world countries. And so what appeared to be misleading and what appeared to maybe at first glance undermine the wealth story is better understood in the context of the number, the sheer number of poor countries in the world as compared to rich countries. And so what this tells us is that we need to look at probabilities and proportions. And so it's better to try to figure out what is the likelihood or what proportion based on the proportion of those countries that transition. Instead of looking at the raw number of transitions, it's better to look at what we would call transition probabilities. And so one author wrote, given the number of country years of a particular type of region, what share or what proportion transitioned at different levels of wealth. And so what I'm trying to highlight here is that the measures that we use matter a great deal because they can be skewed by factors that we don't consider. And the measure in this case that is going to do a better job of sorting out what's happening is one that takes a look at the proportions and the shares of countries at different income levels that transition. And so this is what we'll do then as kind of a corrective here. And this corrective shows us or suggests that income has relatively little effect on the probability of a regime transition. But notice, these are all transitions. These are all transitions. These are not democratic transitions and authoritarian transitions. They are all transitions. What this seems to suggest is that at higher income levels, transitions are less likely or less probable. And what that means then is that income level would have little actual effect. But the question, remember, is that we want to know if the wealth of the country affects its support for democracy. The key question is, how are democratic transitions affected by wealth? Not all regime transitions. It is true that the increase in the probability of transitions at the low end of this income scale is inconsistent with the wealth and the survival story, which say that certain amounts of resources may be necessary for any change to take place. So this higher number of transitions at lower and more moderate income levels seems to contradict the wealth story and the survival story, which seem to suggest, or at least the wealth story, the opposite. But it's also the case that the decrease in the probability of a transition at the high end, right here, I'm having a hard time reading this because I need to move this just a minute. At the high end of the income scale is also inconsistent with the two stories. Because remember that by this point, modernization theory in general says that all countries should be transitioning or should have transitioned to democracy. And so why are there no transitions at a point where wealth should dictate those transitions? Again, though, I want to point out to you that unless we look at democratic transitions and authoritarian traditions separately, it becomes very, very difficult to know if these results hold for democratic transitions or if they are holding for authoritarian transitions in kind of obscuring the real relationship. The evidence suggests at this point that the survival story is incorrect when it predicts that the frequency of those transitions declines with income. And so that much is clear, but the key implication that we need to focus on is the one that lets us distinguish between the survival story and the wealth story. And that is the one that relates to whether increases in wealth actually cause transitions to democracy to become more likely. Remember that the survival story says that those transitions are less likely, or excuse me, that those transitions will not occur as a result of wealth, that those regimes will hold in place once they have a certain income level. But the wealth story says the opposite. It says that transitions become more likely, transitions to democracy become more likely with increases in wealth. And so we need to then examine the kind of transition. And would you imagine, lo and behold, we do see the relationship that we expect. We see that at higher income levels, transitions to democracy are more likely, transitions to dictatorship are less likely. And this is a relationship that is not perfect, but it's one that shows the relationship that we expected to find if we're looking at the wealth story and we're focusing on those considerations that we discussed in our long conversation at the beginning of class, where we talked about how wealthy people have more to lose and therefore there's more at stake for them under dictatorship. That was the reasoning that we arrived at ultimately to maybe suggest that democracy is supported by wealth because of the stakes and because of the gamble involved for wealthy elites under dictatorship. This is really important because it shows us that transitions to democracy do in fact seem to correlate with those rising income levels in the way that we expected. It's the kind of transition that a country experiences that is a function of wealth. Those transitions are, of course, transitions to democracy and transitions to dictatorship. And those kinds of transitions help us to understand the different experiences of countries on the low end of the income scale and the high end. And so where countries transition to democracy more frequently when they are wealthy, countries transition to dictatorship more frequently when they are poor or on the lower income of the wealth or income scale. Now, what this means is that the survival story is not correct when it says that transitions to democracy are unaffected by increases in wealth. It also means that regime transitions become less likely as countries become wealthier is also incorrect, as represented here. These are not supported by the data that we just examined. What is supported by the data that we just examined is the following. First, the idea that democracy is more common in rich countries than poor countries. We saw that. We saw that. We also saw that transitions to dictatorship become less likely as wealth increases. We saw that as well. Notice, we see this. The wealth story we saw in the data is accurate, according to this data, when it says that transitions to democracy become more likely as wealth increases. And we also saw that regime transitions may or not become less likely as countries become wealthier is also true. Now, what this means then ultimately is that wealth does matter. Income levels do matter. And they don't have an immaterial effect. They do affect both transitions as well as the survival of those democracies that are brought about through transitions. And so the bottom line then is that as the wealth story and the survival story predict, increases in income make it more likely that a country will become democratic. Likely for the reasons that we discussed, right? The need for the rich to sort of protect their assets from expropriation, and thus the choice to support or facilitate democratization. And then also, the wealth story and the survival story also predict that increases in income make it more likely that a country will stay democratic. And so not all parts of the survival story have been shown to be incorrect, according to this data. Some parts of them have. But the parts that the wealth story and the survival story agree on are borne out in the evidence. And what I want you to take from this is that income levels and wealth as a measure of development can matter not just because of the class conflicts in the education changes in the rise of the middle class that we discussed last week, but also because of how income levels and wealth levels changing make the rich more vulnerable to expropriation. And that expropriation can more easily happen under a dictatorship than a democracy. And these are the considerations that help to explain the wealth story and the survival story. Now, we're nearly done. And if you need to go, you're welcome to go. I'm going to finish the lecture and take about 2 or 3 more minutes. I have 2 more slides. I'm going to continue recording and I'll stick around and take any questions or comments. But remember that we discussed 3 different mechanisms under class conflicts as explaining the apparent link between development and democracy. Remember that we talked about the bourgeois or merchant class, the middle class, and the working class. Well, Lipset, in addition to focusing on education, as we saw, focused on the role of the middle class as a moderating force that helps to temper the elite and helps to support democracy. We saw that through the rise of the merchant class in early modern Europe, the change in the balance of class power helped to facilitate democratization. Now we focus finally on the working class, and the working class is no less important than those other classes. Principally through demands for better working conditions, the working class has been deeply involved throughout history in facilitating and bringing about democratic transitions and helping to support democracy. This has been depicted in literature like Hard Times by Charles Dickens, which I have on my bookshelf behind me, Germinal by Emile Zola. Other books have captured this as well. Chartism is an example of a class conflict that embroiled the working class. This was a male suffrage movement in England in the mid-19th century, and it sought to expand the franchise beyond property males. Now, remember, this was an abbreviated form of democracy, but this is an example of a class conflict that is stoked and kind of brought about by the working class. And so this does conclude the lecture for today, but I want you to take a few things from this. We've got a number of different mechanisms that help to explain or clarify the link between development and democratization. Those relate not just to class conflicts in the role of the middle class, the merchant class, and the working class, but also to the process of modernization. The process of modernization itself brings about changes in wealth and income, and those changes in wealth and income change the stakes for powerful, rich people, and it makes dictatorship less tenable and makes democracy more favorable for them, because democracy promises to better protect their assets and their riches and their wealth from expropriation that is more likely under a dictatorship. And so this does conclude the lecture. We did a sort of thorough empirical evaluation of one of the most important sets of stories that relate to modernization as a causal mechanism, but we also talked about some working class and middle class and merchant class struggles that help to clarify this mechanism in this link between development and democracy. And so what you take from this, I hope, is that there's a role for class conflicts, but that there's also a role for changes in wealth and income and how those change the options and the stakes for rich people. And so thank you very much for being here. I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to take any comments or questions that you might have related to this or anything else. But thanks again, and I will, of course, be posting the exam at the time that I said, and if everything is clear, I wish you the best of luck, and I have no doubt that you will do well, and I look forward to learning from you and reading your exams. Thank you for being here, and have a great evening, everybody.